It is the winter of 1595. In the dead of night, 19 Ottoman princes, from newborns to young men on the verge of manhood, are dragged from their beds. Cold silk cords tighten around their necks, silent and merciless. Sultan Mehmed III has just taken the throne, and this is the bloodiest throne cleansing in Ottoman history. The question is, for absolute power, what did he trade away? And did that price make the empire stronger, or plant the seeds of its own ruin? In this video, we'll retrace that horrifying night, uncover why a ruler chose to murder his own blood, and explore how this act haunted the Ottoman Empire for generations. To understand the man who would one day order the strangling of 19 brothers, we have to begin in the shadows of the Ottoman harem. Not the romanticised vision from paintings, but the labyrinth of politics, whispers, and invisible blades. Mehmed was born in 56, the son of Sultan Murad III and Safiye Sultan, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her political acumen. From the moment he could walk, Mehmed was not simply a child. He was a potential claimant to the throne, a piece in the empire's most dangerous game. The harem was more than silks and jewels. It was a school of survival. Mehmed learned early that every smile could hide an agenda, every gift could be a trap, and every servant might be someone else's spy. Walls had ears, corridors had eyes. The women of the palace were locked in a quiet war of influence, each seeking to secure their son's path to the throne. And for a boy like Mehmed, this meant living with a truth no child should know. The same brothers he played with could one day become his executioners, or his victims. Ottoman history had already set the precedent. Since the reign of Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, a grim law had been carved into the political reality of the empire: fratricide, the legal right for a new sultan to execute his brothers to prevent civil war. The law was seen not as cruelty, but as pragmatism. An empire divided by rival princes could crumble faster than an enemy army could invade. Mehmed's childhood was shaped by this unspoken but ever-present sword hanging over every prince's head. Even in moments of innocence, lessons in calligraphy, rides in the palace gardens, recitations of the Quran, the reality lingered. To ascend the throne was to kill, or be killed. His father, Murad III, ruled with an iron will, but was often distracted by court intrigues and the indulgences of the harem. Safiye Sultan, however, understood the machinery of power intimately. She whispered to her son lessons not found in holy books: who to trust, when to stay silent, and when silence itself was dangerous. She taught him the subtler weapons: patience, misdirection, and the art of letting others think they were in control until it was too late. But childhood in the palace was not without its moments of terror. Mehmed witnessed the quiet disappearances of uncles and cousins. He heard the muffled rumours after a prince's room was found empty the next morning. He understood the weight of the silk cord before he ever saw it, and each time he learned the same lesson. In the Ottoman dynasty, love was conditional, and family ties were no shield against the throne's hunger. Outside the palace walls, the empire seemed unshakable. Its reach stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. Inside, however, the dynasty's greatest threat came from within. In such a system, paranoia wasn't a flaw, it was a form of armour. By the time Mehmed reached his 20s, he had already internalized the logic of fratricide. He didn't have to like it, he only had to accept it. And so, when fate placed the weight of the empire on his shoulders in 1595, he didn't see the coming night as murder. He saw it as fulfillment of the very law that had kept the Ottoman Empire standing for over a century, and the only path to ensuring it stayed in one piece. But the question that would haunt history was already in the air. When you are raised in a cage built of silk and fear, do you ever truly rule, or are you only carrying out the will of the cage itself? January 15th, 1595. Sultan Murad III is dead. His body lies in the imperial chamber, shrouded in white linen. Outside, the palace is in a strange kind of stillness. Not silence, but the hushed, controlled tension that always follows the death of an Ottoman sultan. Everyone knows that before the next dawn, the empire will have a new ruler. And everyone also knows what usually comes next. Mehmed, now 29, is declared sultan. On the surface, it is a moment of triumph for Mehmed. The boy raised in the guarded corridors of Topkapi has become the ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the world. But under that gilded title, he feels the cold weight of a different inheritance: the law of fratricide, still unchallenged since it was written into imperial code more than a century ago. This is not a law anyone quotes in public ceremonies. It is spoken in the private language of survival, whispered between viziers, remembered in the glances exchanged between guards, and felt most sharply by the princes themselves. In the hours after his father's death, Mehmed is summoned to a private council with his mother, Safiye Sultan. She sits behind a screen as tradition dictates, her voice calm and deliberate. She reminds him of the dangers that have haunted the empire for centuries: rival claimants to the throne, rebellions led by ambitious governors, the bloody civil wars of the past when the Ottoman dynasty was split between competing princes. But her words are not warnings, they're instructions. Act now, or they will act first, she tells him. Mehmed doesn't need to ask who she means. His brothers, 19 of them, are scattered across the palace, some mere infants still in the care of wet nurses, others old enough to understand exactly what the night might bring. Each one is a potential rallying point for a rebellion. Each one, in the brutal logic of Ottoman politics, is a threat to be neutralized. History offers no record of hesitation. If there was a moment of inner conflict, it is buried under the silence of palace walls. What we do know is that Mehmed accepted his mother's counsel and the advice of his viziers. Preparations began almost immediately. The method had already been decided long before: the silk cord. It was the humane method, at least by the standards of the time. No blood was to be spilled in the palace. Execution by strangulation was considered a way to avoid the religious taboo of shedding royal blood. To the Ottomans, this was not murder in the common sense. It was the execution of a necessary law, carried out in the name of imperial stability. As word spread through the inner court, the atmosphere thickened. Guards moved through the corridors with purpose, avoiding eye contact. Servants whispered to each other, and then quickly fell silent when footsteps approached. The palace eunuchs, long accustomed to such orders, prepared for the task with mechanical precision. The fear was not limited to the princes. Even high-ranking officials knew that in moments of succession, loyalty was a fragile thing. One wrong gesture, one word taken the wrong way, could mean the difference between being in the Sultan's favour or sharing the fate of his brothers. Outside Topkapi's walls, the city of Constantinople continued its daily rhythm. Markets bustled, prayers echoed from minarets, unaware that within the palace, the foundations of power were being laid in silence and suffocation. For Mehmed, the decision to carry out the fratricide was not, at least in his own mind, an act of cruelty. It was the acceptance of a duty he had been groomed for since childhood. The empire could not afford the luxury of sentiment, and if he did not act, he risked being remembered as the Sultan who hesitated, the Sultan who allowed civil war to tear the Ottoman world apart. Still, the choice was absolute. There was no going back. Once the order was given, 19 lives, all bound to him by blood, would be ended in a single night. In the cold calculation of the Ottoman court, the coronation and the executions were two halves of the same ritual. One could not happen without the other. And as Mehmed prepared to take his place on the throne, the corridors of Topkapi began to shift under the weight of an unspoken truth. By sunrise, the empire would belong to him alone. The question that remains, centuries later, is whether it was truly his choice, or if he was simply carrying out the inevitable consequence of a system that had trained him, since birth, to see survival and slaughter as one and the same. The order was given, not shouted, not read aloud. It moved like a shadow through the palace, carried in low voices, passed between the hands of eunuchs and guards who had long since learned how to carry death without letting it stain their faces. The night was cold, the air heavy with the smell of the sea, drifting in from the Bosphorus. In the women's quarters, candles burned low, throwing wavering light across silk curtains and marble floors. The sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, grew louder in the stillness. The executioners moved from chamber to chamber. Each prince was taken in the order their rooms were arranged. No favouritism, no hesitation. For the infants, the task was done quickly, their cries muffled before they could carry. For the older boys and young men it was different. They knew enough to resist, to twist, to kick, to shout, but there was nowhere to run. The doors were locked, the windows barred, the palace itself a cage. Those who tried to fight were pinned by 2 or 3 guards, while another slipped the silk cord around their neck. To modern eyes, silk might seem a strange weapon, a thing of beauty turned into an instrument of death. But in the Ottoman court, the silk cord was both symbol and sentence. It killed without spilling royal blood, a final courtesy in a system where mercy ended at the threshold of the throne room. Some accounts, written years later by foreign visitors, claim that the struggle could be heard down the corridors, gasps, thuds, the scrape of furniture overturned. But the palace itself was vast, and its walls were built to keep sound from spilling out. Outside, the city slept, oblivious to the fact that 19 branches of the Ottoman family tree were being cut down at the root. The bodies, once still, were wrapped in cloth and carried away under cover of darkness. No ceremony, no prayers, no mourning. The law of fratricide demanded efficiency. In the eyes of the state, these were not sons, nephews, or brothers anymore. They were dangers neutralized. By the time the executioners reached the final chamber, the routine had become almost mechanical. Grip, loop, pull, hold until there was no movement. It was the same method used for traitors and spies, except here, the condemned had royal blood and childhood memories with the man who now sat on the throne. And where was Mehmed III during these hours? The records are silent. Tradition suggests he would not witness the act directly. That task fell to his agents. But it is difficult to imagine he slept. Whether he sat in the throne room, pacing the marble floor, or knelt in prayer, we cannot know. What we can be certain of is this. By the time the first light of morning touched the domes of Topkapi, he was the only surviving male of his generation in the dynasty. The 19 bodies were buried quickly, somewhere within the palace grounds. No monuments marked their graves. No names were carved in stone. In a few years, even their faces would fade from the memory of those who had known them. But the absence, the sheer echoing absence, would linger in the palace like a draught in winter. News of the night spread fast among the court. Even those who supported the necessity of the law were unsettled by the scale of it. 19 at once was a number that chilled the blood. Foreign ambassadors sent hurried reports back to their kings and queens, describing a succession unlike anything they had seen, a coronation crowned in silence and sealed in death. For Mehmed, the throne was now secure, but it was a throne built on absence. Every face that might have sat beside him at a family banquet, every voice that might have offered counsel or challenge, was gone. The corridors of Topkapi must have felt wider in the days that followed, the air heavier, the silence deeper. The empire called it stability. Historians would later call it the bloodiest application of fratricide in Ottoman history. And for Mehmed, whether he admitted it or not, it was the night that would define his reign, a single choice that could never be undone, a decision that would follow him like a shadow to his grave. By dawn, the corridors of Topkapi Palace had been scrubbed clean. The bedding was replaced, the furniture reset, and the doors locked again. From the outside, it looked as though nothing had happened. But inside, every servant, every guard, every courtier who had been there that night now carried a knowledge that they could never speak aloud. Mehmed III had become Sultan in the most absolute sense of the word. The 19 princes were gone, and with them, any immediate challenge to his throne. This was how power was secured in the Ottoman world, not by chance, not by luck, but by deliberate elimination. The silk cords had done more than silence his brothers, they had silenced doubt itself. But power gained through fear needs constant feeding. In the weeks after the fratricide, Mehmed moved quickly to consolidate his position. He rewarded those who had carried out his orders, elevating loyalists to key positions in the imperial court. Viziers who hesitated were quietly dismissed or replaced. Governors in the provinces were reminded, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, that the new sultan was not a man to test. At the heart of the court's power structure was his mother, Safiye Sultan. With her political instincts sharpened over decades in the harem, she became more than a royal mother. She was his chief advisor, his shield against rival factions, and in many ways, the architect of his reign. Her influence reached into every appointment, every alliance, every negotiation. Those who wished to gain the Sultan's favour knew that a gift to Safiye was often as effective as an appeal to Mehmed himself. The palace itself reflected this shift. Public ceremonies became more controlled, more choreographed, with layers of guards and officials shielding the Sultan from any direct approach. Mehmed understood that survival depended on keeping threats at a distance, physically and politically, but the fortress of fear had its costs. The fratricide had left a void not only in the family, but in the council chamber. There were no brothers to send as governors to distant provinces, no princes to lead armies on the frontier. Instead, Mehmed relied heavily on career administrators and seasoned generals whose loyalty lay with whoever could guarantee their survival. And loyalty purchased in this way was fragile. It could be bought again by someone else. To maintain control, Mehmed authorized a series of purges within the bureaucracy and the military. Officials suspected of divided loyalties were removed, sometimes quietly, sometimes with public disgrace. Accusations of corruption, treachery, or incompetence became tools in the political arsenal, used to remove anyone whose allegiance was uncertain. In this climate, fear was both a weapon and a language. Court officials learned to read Mehmed's silences, to interpret the smallest changes in his tone or expression. A raised eyebrow in the wrong moment could mean the end of a career. Outside the palace, the public image of the Sultan was carefully managed. Official proclamations framed the fratricide not as a massacre, but as a necessary act to preserve the unity of the empire. Preachers in mosques spoke of the dangers of fitna, internal division, and praised the wisdom of the Sultan in preventing it. Whether the people believed this or not was another matter, but in a society where dissent could be deadly, few voiced open opposition. Still, whispers travelled. Merchants, soldiers, and foreign envoys carried the story beyond Constantinople, each telling shaped by their own perspective. To some, Mehmed was a decisive ruler who had acted with the clarity the empire needed. To others, he was a man so consumed by fear that he murdered his own blood before he could even wear the crown for a full day. What cannot be denied is that the night of the fratricide set the tone for the rest of his reign. Decisions were made swiftly, often brutally. Mercy was rare, suspicion constant. In this new order, survival meant aligning oneself closely with the Sultan's will, or at least making it appear so. In the end, Mehmed's throne was secure, but it rested on a foundation that demanded constant vigilance. Fear could keep challengers at bay, but it could not inspire loyalty and it could not build trust. And while the silk cords had removed 19 threats in a single night, they had also bound Mehmed to a truth he could never escape. In securing the empire, he had made himself its most solitary man. The year was 1595, and the Ottoman Empire was already locked in a grinding war with the Holy League, a coalition of Christian powers determined to push the Sultan's forces back from Europe. Wallachia, a principality wedged between Ottoman lands and the Habsburg sphere of influence, was supposed to be a loyal vassal. Its ruler, Michael the Brave, had sworn allegiance to the Porte, sending tribute and offering military support. But in the shifting loyalties of the Balkans, allegiance could turn overnight. When Mehmed III received reports that Michael had broken with the empire and allied himself with the Habsburgs, he treated it not as mere rebellion, but as a personal betrayal. The Sultan's orders were uncompromising. Wallachia was to be punished, and the punishment would be remembered. Ottoman forces poured north through the Danube Valley. Behind them came the dreaded Akunja, raiders who specialized in terror, moving fast, striking without warning, leaving only smoke and ash in their wake. Villages were burned to the ground, their fields blackened and useless. Entire communities were uprooted. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who surrendered were chained and marched south as spoils of war. The campaign was not just about defeating Michael's army. It was about sending a message to every other vassal state watching from the sidelines. Defy the Sultan, and your land will drink fire. Contemporary accounts from the region, many from monks, merchants, and foreign envoys, describe the devastation in almost biblical terms. One Wallachian chronicler wrote that the air was thick with the smoke of our homes, and the rivers ran not with water, but with the ashes of the dead. While these words may be shaped by grief and rage, there is no doubt that the destruction was real and widespread. The brutality also served another purpose. Within the Ottoman army, tales of the Sultan's resolve circulated like campfire legends. For soldiers, these stories confirmed that Mehmed was not a ruler to be tested. For commanders, they were reminders that failure was not an option, because the same merciless judgment could just as easily be turned inward. In Constantinople, the campaign was framed as a necessary cleansing, a righteous punishment of a faithless vassal. The court poets and chroniclers softened the edges, speaking of discipline and order, rather than mass killing. But beyond the city walls, where no official scribe could control the narrative, the name of Mehmed III became synonymous with burning fields and empty villages. Even allies began to take note. The princes of Moldavia, Transylvania, and other borderlands understood the lesson. Loyalty to the Porte would bring rewards, but wavering could mean annihilation. It was fear diplomacy, the same method Mehmed had used inside his own palace, now applied to the empire's frontier. But fear is a blunt instrument. It could bend a province to obedience in the short term, yet it also bred resentment. Wallachia's resistance did not end with the destruction of its villages. In fact, the survivors' hatred would fuel Michael the Brave's determination to keep fighting, drawing the Ottomans deeper into a costly and exhausting war in Eastern Europe. The Wallachian campaign also highlighted a dangerous pattern in Mehmed's leadership. The same instinct that had driven him to eliminate 19 brothers at once, to remove threats swiftly and absolutely, was now being applied to foreign policy. Subtlety and negotiation gave way to overwhelming force, with little regard for the long-term consequences. For the Ottoman Empire, the campaign in Wallachia was a tactical victory wrapped in a strategic gamble. The immediate threat was crushed, but the scars it left, both on the land and in the minds of those who lived there, would last for generations. And for Mehmed, it was another affirmation of a truth he already lived by. Power, once taken, must be defended not with kindness, but with the kind of fear that makes resistance unthinkable. Yet even as the smoke cleared in Wallachia, another front was demanding his attention, a far larger one, where the enemy was not a rebellious vassal, but the Habsburg armies themselves. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest confrontations of his reign. By the autumn of 1596, the fires of Wallachia were still smouldering, but the Ottoman Empire was already being pulled into a much larger storm. The Holy League, that uneasy alliance of Habsburg Austria, Transylvania, and various European powers, had pushed deep into Ottoman territory. The war was no longer about rebellious vassals. This was the empire's survival on the European front. Mehmed III faced a choice no sultan had confronted in decades: remain in the safety of Constantinople and direct the war from afar, or lead his army into battle in person. The tradition of Ottoman sultans personally commanding armies had faded over the years, replaced by campaigns led by grand viziers and seasoned generals. But Mehmed, perhaps eager to prove himself after the whispers of his bloody ascension, chose the older path. He would ride to war himself. In the summer of 1596, the imperial army gathered. Chroniclers estimated its size at over 100,000 men, a force of janissaries, sipahis, artillery and auxiliary troops from across the empire. Behind them came a massive supply train stretching for miles, wagons piled with powder, food, tents, and the trappings of a campaign meant to sustain a siege or crush an enemy in open battle. Their target was the fortress town of Eger in the Kingdom of Hungary. But before they could secure it, the Ottomans would meet the full force of the Holy League at Mezokarestes, a battlefield that would test both Mehmed's leadership and the endurance of his army. The battle began in October, under a pale autumn sun. The Christian coalition, smaller but fiercely motivated, dug in along a line of hills. The Ottomans advanced with artillery fire and waves of infantry, their cannons pounding the enemy positions. At first, the tide seemed in the Sultan's favour. By midday, the Holy League's forces began to break. Ottoman soldiers surged forward, capturing the enemy's richly stocked camp. Here, discipline faltered. Many troops, thinking victory was secured, abandoned the fight to plunder the spoils: gold, weapons, food, and fine goods brought by the Christian army. It was then that the coalition launched a desperate counterattack. The plundering Ottomans were caught scattered and unprepared. Panic spread. Even the Janissaries, the empire's elite troops, began to fall back under the sudden onslaught. In that moment, Mehmed's presence on the battlefield proved decisive. Surrounded by his advisors and guards, he ordered an immediate rally, sending reserve units forward to plug the gaps. His commanders, some of whom had fought in dozens of campaigns, steadied the lines and pushed back. By nightfall, the Holy League's army was in retreat and the field belonged to the Ottomans. But victory had come at a staggering cost. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead or wounded, their bodies mingled with those of their enemies across the muddy field. The stench of blood and smoke hung heavy in the air for days. The Sultan returned to Constantinople as a victor, the first in generations to lead his army in person and return alive. Yet behind the public celebrations, there was no ignoring the toll. The war with Austria and Transylvania was far from over, and each victory seemed to demand a price the empire could barely afford to pay. Reports from the front told of villages emptied, both by the passing armies and the scorched earth tactics used on all sides. In Hungary and Transylvania, the Ottoman name was tied not only to conquest, but to the killing of prisoners and the burning of civilian settlements, acts intended to break resistance but which often fueled it instead. Inside the palace, Mehmed's position was stronger than ever. He had shown that he could win on the battlefield as well as in the political arena. But the empire was bleeding, its treasury strained, its manpower diminished, and its borders still contested. The victory at Mezocarestes would be remembered in Ottoman history as a moment of glory. Yet it also carried the shadow of a warning. In this war, every triumph was soaked in so much blood that it was hard to tell where the enemy's losses ended and the empire's own wounds began. From the outside, Mehmed III's reign could be summed up in two words: victory and fear. He had secured his throne, crushed a rebellious vassal, and stood triumphant against a powerful Christian coalition. To the casual observer, he was the image of an unassailable sultan. But history, when you strip away the banners and the proclamations, tells a more complicated story. The truth begins with the law of fratricide, an Ottoman legal principle enshrined since the 15th century under Mehmed II, the Conqueror. It allowed, even encouraged, a new sultan to kill his brothers upon ascending the throne, on the argument that this was necessary to prevent civil war. For over a century, the law had been treated as a grim necessity, one that saved the empire from being torn apart by rival princes leading separate factions. By the time Mehmed III inherited the throne, this law was not a controversial topic within the palace. It was a political reflex. He had been raised with it the way a soldier is trained to load a musket, not as a question of morality, but as a matter of procedure. To modernise, it is almost impossible to separate the man from the massacre. How could any ruler justify strangling 19 brothers, some still children, some perhaps too young to even know the stakes? But to the political mind of the late 16th century Ottoman court, the logic was chillingly clear. One night of slaughter could prevent decades of instability. There is no surviving records of Mehmed questioning the law, no sign of hesitation before giving the order. This absence could mean he accepted it fully, or it could mean that any doubts were buried under the iron mask of duty. In a court where hesitation could be read as weakness, doubt itself could be fatal, but fratricide was not the only tool in his arsenal. The same worldview that justified killing one's own blood also justified ruling through intimidation. Mehmed saw threats everywhere, in vassal states, in foreign powers, even in his own court. His responses were decisive but almost always brutal. Wallachia burned. Hungarian villages were emptied. Prisoners were killed in masses after Mezocarestes. In his mind, these were not excesses. They were extensions of the same principle that had governed his first night as sultan. The empire must be kept whole, no matter the cost. Yet there is a dangerous paradox in this way of thinking. The more fear is used to maintain control, the more fear becomes the only thing holding the system together. And fear, unlike loyalty, does not bind hearts, it only binds hands. By relying on the law of fratricide, Mehmed had removed every male relative who could challenge him. But in doing so, he also removed potential allies. The Ottoman dynasty had long relied on its princes not just as rivals, but as governors, generals, and symbols of imperial presence in the provinces. With 19 princes gone, Mehmed's court was left without a generation of royal leaders. The burden of governance shifted to bureaucrats, viziers, and soldiers whose loyalty was transactional. Even foreign diplomats noticed. Reports to European courts describe Mehmed as secure but alone, a ruler surrounded by advisors but with no family to check his power or temper his decisions. It was a dangerous position, one where the ruler's judgment went unchallenged, where suspicion could become policy overnight. The irony is almost poetic. The law of fratricide was meant to preserve the dynasty, but in practice it left Mehmed's branch of the family tree dangerously thin. By the time his reign ended, the line of succession was fragile, and his only surviving son, Ahmed I, would inherit a throne haunted by the memory of what it took to make it his. Unmasking the truth about Mehmed III's reign reveals this contradiction. He was both a protector and a destroyer of his own house. His methods worked in the short term, the empire held together, his throne unshaken, but they carried seeds of long-term instability. To rule by eliminating threats is to live in a constant state of siege, even within your own walls. And in Mehmed's case, the walls of Topkapi were high enough to keep out enemies, but not high enough to keep out the consequences of his own fear. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was still standing, but it bore the marks of strain. Years of war had drained the treasury and bled the provinces. The victories of Mehmed III were real, but so were the scars they left, on both the battlefield and in the palace. The Sultan himself was only in his mid-30s, yet by all accounts, he had begun to show the wear of constant vigilance. Ruling an empire through fear is not a peaceful task. It requires the mind to remain in a state of perpetual readiness, watching for enemies that might not even exist yet. Those who saw him in his final years described a man heavier in body, slower in movement, but still sharp-eyed, still carrying the weight of the crown with a grip that would not loosen. In December 1603, that grip would finally fail. The official record says that Mehmed III died of natural causes, an illness that had weakened him for weeks. Yet even in death, the air around him was thick with suspicion. Rumours spread quickly. Some whispered he had been poisoned, perhaps by factions within the court eager to place his young son Ahmed on the throne. Others hinted that the poison might have been the work of foreign agents hoping to destabilise the empire at a vulnerable moment. No evidence survives to confirm these tales. What we do know is that his death came suddenly, at a time when the empire was still engaged in war with Austria and facing internal unrest. His passing forced the court into another tense succession, one in which the law of fratricide, still unbroken, hung over the palace like a shadow. Ahmed I, just 13 years old, became sultan. The boy had seen what the law could do. The memory of his father's first night on the throne, the night his 19 uncles vanished, was not something he could forget. It is telling that one of Ahmed's first significant acts as ruler was to break with tradition. He ended the practice of mass fratricide, replacing it with the system of cafes, the cage, where princes were kept under guarded confinement instead of being executed outright. This single change was, in a way, a direct verdict on Mehmed III's reign. The son's reform was an unspoken acknowledgement that the father's most infamous act had cast too long and too dark a shadow over the dynasty. In the years after his death, Ottoman chroniclers, careful not to openly criticise the sultan, wrote of Mehmed in guarded terms. They praised his victories in Hungary, his commitment to the unity of the empire, and his personal presence on the battlefield at Mesokarestis. But the night of the fratricide was always there, unspoken yet unavoidable. Foreign observers, less restrained, recorded it openly. A prince who began his reign in blood and ruled in the constant fear of his own kin. The historical verdict on Mehmed III is a study in contrasts. He was a man who could command an army of 100,000 across the Danube and bring it home in victory, yet who also saw danger in the cradle of an infant brother. He could be decisive, bold, even personally courageous in war, yet his most remembered decision was one carried out by others in the quiet halls of the palace, far from the battlefield. Perhaps the truest judgment is that Mehmed III was a product of the system that made him. The law of fratricide, the politics of the harem, the paranoia of an empire ringed by enemies, these forces shaped him from birth. And when the moment came to act, he did not break from them. He fulfilled them. His grave lies in the courtyard of Hagia Sophia near the tombs of other sultans. Visitors pass by the marble marker, many without realizing that beneath it lies the man who presided over one of the most infamous nights in Ottoman history. The stone is silent, as stones always are, but for those who know the story, the silence is heavy, filled with the memory of silk cords in the dark, of a throne secured at the cost of blood that could never be washed away. The death of Mehmed III did not bury his legacy, it only set it loose. In the corridors of Topkapi Palace, his reign became a cautionary tale, retold in whispers by servants and in guarded conversations among the court. The night of 1595 was not mentioned in official ceremonies, but it lived in memory like a scar you couldn't help but trace with your fingers. The 19 brothers he had strangled never had the chance to grow into rivals, allies, or even distant administrators of the empire. This meant that his successors inherited a royal family that was not only smaller but dangerously fragile. The Ottoman dynasty was built on the principle of having multiple heirs, a safeguard against the unexpected death of a sultan. By cutting away an entire generation in one night, Mehmed had left the family tree thin and exposed. The law of fratricide had achieved its intended purpose in the short term. No civil war broke out when he ascended the throne, but the long-term cost was a dynasty that now relied on far fewer male heirs, increasing the risk of a succession crisis with every generation. In a system where rulers were chosen from the surviving princes, fewer princes meant fewer options and less stability. Ahmed III's decision to replace fratricide with the cafes, the cage, was more than a legal reform. It was an attempt to exorcise his father's shadow. In the cage system, princes were confined to a section of the palace under heavy guard, cut off from political life but allowed to live. It was a compromise between mercy and security, but it created its own problems. Princes who grew up in isolation emerged unprepared for rule, often naive or unstable. Yet the alternative was to risk another night like the one in 1595. Beyond the palace, Mehmed's legacy became part of the empire's folklore. In coffee houses and marketplaces, storytellers spoke of the Sultan, who began his reign by killing his blood. These stories were rarely told with the exact numbers or details, but the essence was always the same, a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. In some versions, the Sultan was portrayed as a tragic figure, doomed by the laws he inherited. In others, he was the villain of the tale, the man who chose the silk cord over compassion. The shadow of fratricide also coloured the way foreign powers viewed the Ottoman court. European ambassadors recorded the story in their reports, framing it as evidence of the empire's cruelty and despotism. To them, it was a sign that Ottoman rulers saw even their own families as expendable, a mindset that could make diplomacy unpredictable and dangerous. Inside the empire, the fear that had once kept governors and vassal states in line began to change shape. Mehmed's reputation for swift and merciless action lingered, but without him, it became more of a memory than a reality. The lesson other rulers took from his reign was not just about strength, it was about the isolation that comes from ruling through terror. Some Ottoman chroniclers tried to soften the narrative, writing that the fratricide was necessary for the peace of the realm, but even they could not erase the number. 19. It hung in the air, too heavy to be forgotten, too large to be explained away. In the end, Mehmed III's legacy was not a single act, but the culture of fear it reinforced. He had demonstrated that the throne could be made absolutely secure, but only at the cost of hollowing out the very family that sustained it. The Ottoman Empire would survive him for centuries, but the methods he used left a blueprint that later rulers either followed or deliberately rejected. The long shadow of fratricide was not just cast over the dynasty, it reached into the soul of the empire itself. It shaped how rulers saw their kin, how subjects saw their rulers, and how history would remember the night when the silk cords closed on 19 lives so that one man could sit alone on a throne. History will often tell you that Mehmed III acted out of necessity, that the law of fratricide was a tool of stability, not cruelty, that 19 deaths in one night saved the empire from decades of bloodshed. But when I walk through the courtyards of Topkapi, I don't hear stability, I hear absence. I see the space at a banquet table where a brother might have sat. I picture the empty saddles in the imperial stables. I think of the voices, young, laughing, maybe even loyal, that were silenced before they could prove what else they might have been. Perhaps the empire did stand stronger in the short term, but at what cost? In removing every threat, Mehmed also removed every ally who might have tempered his fears or shared his burdens. He secured his throne, but he also secured his loneliness. And in the end, his own son would quietly undo his most defining act, not because it was unlawful, but because it was unbearable. To me, this is the lesson of Mehmed III's reign. Power taken by fear can be held for a lifetime, but it leaves nothing worth passing on. The law may permit it, the empire may applaud it, but history remembers the cost in blood. If you've stayed with me until now, you already know that these aren't just stories about the past. They are reminders about the choices we make in pursuit of power, and the shadows those choices cast for generations. This is the Nameless Scribe, and if you want more true histories told without flinching, the kind that look behind the curtain and speak of the silences as much as the facts, subscribe and stay with me. There are more names, more nights, and more truths still buried in the dust of time.